talk now about the right to protest. We saw a lot of activity yesterday. In 2017, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa launched a research document in the wake of the Fees Must Fall protests of 2015-2016. The publication is titled Student Protests, a Legal and Practical Guide. It's described by Siri as a user-friendly guide that explains students' rights to protest as well as their rights when they are arrested, detained or charged with a crime during a protest. The Institute's Executive Director, Nomzamo Zondo, joins me now via Zoom for a discussion on this. And Nomzamo, I consider what you put together to be the Bible, really, of activists, for activists arranging to, go on a march, on a picket, with the possibility that they could encounter police action. From your understanding of the right to protest, peacefully and unarmed in terms of the Constitution as well as the law, the Regulation of Gatherings Act, what did you make of what happened yesterday in the Braamfontein CBD?
Sure. It was a dismal failure of the police to understand their duties, both in relation to facilitating protests and even complying with their own internal prescripts. So you covered the Marikana Commission of Inquiry. You are aware of Standing Order 262, which at least since 2004 has been the standing instruction for the police and what they should do in case there's been a protest. In this case, this was a spontaneous protest. It's been going on for over 5 days, but it was spontaneous. They got to the ground. Their policy tells them the first thing that you must do, engage. Engage who's there, engage the leadership, engage the stakeholders. It tells them what their role is. Their role is to keep the peace, keep everyone safe. Their role is to de-escalate violence. And they did the opposite of all those things.
Here's what concerned me, Nomzamo. On a number of occasions during the protests yesterday, I didn't get a sense that there was an attempt to differentiate between protesters who were being peaceful and protesters who were engaging in violence. Does that distinction matter in terms of what we know, in terms of our law?
Definitely. I mean, the challenge is that, in fact, from what I saw, the violence was started by the police. There wasn't any violence at all. I think even the police had to accept this up until they started shooting at students, right? And if anything happened after that, it's what in our law is recognized as self-defense. But in terms of dealing with protests where people are armed or where there is a threat of violence, the police have to isolate the threat of violence in a way that keeps the whole community protected. And by the whole community, it includes the protesters. It includes bystanders, like the person who died. And they just simply fail to do that.
And this happens a lot, does it not? This failure to isolate where the violence is coming from and responding to that particular violence, but an approach that says disperse everyone, with the result that a man coming out of a doctor's room could actually be hit with a number of rubber bullets.
So you won't believe, Thulasizwe, on Tuesday, our office were in a meeting with the UN Special Rapporteur on protest. And we said the key challenge for protesters is policing and violence from the police. Not because there's been violence to begin with, but because the police only manage crowd incidents through violence. The go-to for them is to disperse, and to disperse using force. But again, Standing Order 262 tells them that order is the very last resort. It then even tells them that you are only allowed to use force where there is a serious risk to someone's life. So in this case, we have the police using stun grenades, using rubber bullets, and doing all of that without there being anybody's life at risk. In fact, there wasn't even a risk to property. So we were in a situation where the police went ahead and actually started the violence. So what we should be talking about today is how many of those policemen have been charged criminally for assaulting students.
So,
how many
sorry, Nomzamo, just two other things that I want to touch on before we conclude. The EFF leader, Julius Malema, yesterday asking questions that point to, a gradual approach to resorting to using force to disperse a protest, right? He aptly asks, where were the water cannons? Where were the shields for the police to try and push back the students? Where was the tear gas before we got to rubber bullets. Does he have a point that there should have been and there should be, in all instances, a measured and gradual approach that responds to the violence in terms of, degree, that as the violence escalates, you escalate your response as well. You don't go to the first, the highest level of response.
So, Thulasizwe, what actually happened was we saw water cannons, stun grenades, rubber bullets within a 10-minute, probably 5 to 10-minute period, right? So for the police, there was an escalation. But that escalation was related to anything of what was happening on the ground, because students were being shot while they were dispersing in response to stun grenades, in response to water cannons. But as I said, the issue is you use violence to deter other violence. Your response can't be, because in fact the police, even in one clip where a student was arrested, he was told you are blockading a road. That is not violence. In that instance, what the police are supposed to do is assist motorists to find alternative routes or negotiate with the student leadership to find a way where both the motorists and the protests can continue.
Yeah, in fact, that last point that you just mentioned goes to the heart of the right to protest. There's a perception that protests shouldn't be disruptive. That's not the right perception. That's not what our Constitution says, right? Actually, protests that are disruptive is exactly what the Constitution seeks to protect in terms of the guide that you guys put together at Siri.
Definitely, this is the challenge, right? Our Constitution comes in 1993 and comes into effect in 1994. And it's written on a history of protest that is before that, both in this country and globally. If people assemble, the first thing that they do, they assemble on national roads, they assemble on local roads, they block traffic, they block entrances. This happens during strikes, this happens during protests against private players, and always in those instances there is disruption. Disruption is a key component of protest. And in fact, even within the labor framework, there's an acceptance that what striking workers will do is engage and stop and interfere with suppliers, interfere with other workers to convince them to join in their concern. In the very same way, the students are entitled to disrupt the lives of others for as long as there's no violence. That's why the Constitution provides for peaceful assembly. And what happened yesterday was peaceful assembly, but unfortunately it became violent because the police became.
All right, Nomzamo, thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate it. And I can only imagine that I'll probably be pummeled somewhere in the South African universe for, defending violence. Just do yourself a favor, read a few of the judgments that are relevant to this particular matter. Read the Constitution, the Regulation of Gatherings Act, the judgment in Satau, the judgment Rhodes University, Satau versus Gavas. Read that, Rhodes University. Then you'll see what I'm talking about when I talk about disruption, which is distinct from violence, wanton violence by protesters. And even then, it's not automatic that people lose their rights to protest. There was Nomzamo Zondo there from Siri, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa.